In a reality in which the Third Reich emerged victorious from the Second World War, the city of Germania emerged as the pinnacle of Nazi power and dominance. He was the embodiment of Adolf Hitler's delusions of grandeur, a dream turned nightmare that materialized in a monstrous capital, destined to last for 1,000 years. The origin of Germania dates back to the 1920s, when Hitler, in his work Mein Kampf, outlined the first ideas of a new capital for the Reich. The Berlin of the time, with its historic buildings and provincial air, was for him a reflection of the weakness that had to be overcome. He wanted a capital that would not only rival the great civilizations of the past, but surpass them in magnificence and power. With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, this dream began to take shape, and the first machinations to transform Berlin into Germania began to come to life. Albert Speer, a young architect who had proved useful to the regime, was appointed in 1937 as the General Inspector of Construction for the Reich capital. Under his direction, the Welthauptstadt Germania project began to take on more defined contours. Speer's vision, fueled by Hitler's whims, was that of a monumental city where every building, every street, would speak to the unbreakable power of the Nazi regime. The plans were ambitious, excessive, a reflection of a mind obsessed with grandeur and domination. In 1938, the first demolitions began in Berlin. Entire neighborhoods such as Alsen and Tiergarten were razed, driving thousands of people from their homes, mostly Jewish families who saw their property confiscated and their lives shattered. The soil on which a diverse and vibrant community once flourished turned to rubble, the first of many victims on the altar of the new Germania. The heart of Germania was to be the Volkshalle, a colossal dome, inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, but much grander. This building, designed to house up to 180,000 people, was to be the ultimate symbol of Nazi power, a place where the regime's greatest propaganda events would be held. In front of it, an avenue 125 meters wide would cross the city from north to south, culminating in an Arc de Triomphe that would make the one in Paris look like a mere ornament in comparison. Along this avenue, massive granite buildings, statues of Aryan leaders and symbols of German military might would rise, all carefully designed to intimidate and subjugate. The Reichskanzlei would be another of the pillars of this monstrous city. This building, redesigned by Speer, was to reflect the Führer's absolute authority. Here, in rooms decorated with marble and gold, the decisions that would govern the destiny of millions would be made. But behind this splendor, horror lurked. The designs included secret prisons and chambers where the most unimaginable atrocities were planned, all under the guise of cold and ruthless efficiency. As the project progressed, a gigantic stadium, the Stadion der Germania, was built entirely of granite. Here, under the grey skies of a regime that had set out to erase individuality, the Reich Olympic Games would be held, competitions designed to glorify Aryan supremacy. The stands, designed to hold hundreds of thousands of spectators, would witness military parades and demonstrations of force that reminded everyone of the omnipotence of the Third Reich. But urban design deliberately excluded the common citizen. Public spaces intended for the glorification of the state were forbidden to ordinary pedestrians, relegated to peripheral neighborhoods, while the city center was reserved for the regime's elites and military parades. The buildings were erected on the basis of forced labor, with concentration camp prisoners enslaved to death in a work that, in its scale and cruelty, was unprecedented. However, the war that had brought the Nazis to absolute power would also become their condemnation. World War II, which in this alternate reality ended in a victory for the Axis, left Germany as the undisputed dominator of Europe, but it also drained its resources. As the armed forces extended their control over territories further and further afield, the construction of Germania began to stall. By 1943, with the conflicts in the East and the maintenance of a vast empire at constant war, the resources needed to build the capital of the world began to run low. The Germania project was put on hold, not for lack of will, but because the Nazi colossus, although victorious, was suffocated by the very wars it had unleashed. The triumph had come at a terrible cost. Millions of lives had been lost, and the economy, although sustained by the plunder of the occupied nations, could not keep up with the demands of such a vast project. When the war finally ended, there was no peace. only a state of continuous repression. The Reich, though seemingly invincible, was a giant with feet of clay. The economy, sustained by slave labor and plunder, began to crumble. The revolts in the occupied territories, although brutally put down, further drained the regime's resources. German soldiers, weary of endless war, began to question the glory they had been promised, but any dissenting voices were quickly silenced. The city, partially built, remained as a monument to excess and barbarism. The foundations of buildings that were never finished became mass graves for those who died in their construction. The stadium, once dreamed of full of Aryan cheers, was left empty, a hollow shell in which only the echo of the wind could be heard. But over the centuries, the construction of Germania was resumed, and it effectively became the capital of the world. Its monumental structures, designed to last for centuries, evolved to adapt to the most advanced technologies and the plundered resources of entire continents and planets. Granite, which had been chosen for its strength, was complemented by new materials quarried from distant lands, each more exotic and resistant than the last. Nazi engineering, driven by a mixture of excessive ambition and absolute control over science, managed to erect a city that defied time and nature. The Volkshalle, for example, was completed in the middle of the 22nd century. This building, which could hold hundreds of thousands of people, became the site of the Reich's global assemblies, a propaganda spectacle that took everyone's breath away. The walls, lined with materials brought from colonies on Mars and other celestial bodies, shone with an intensity that seemed supernatural. Germania not only survived the wars that followed, but transcended them. With control of the resources of the entire planet and space colonies, the Reich was able to maintain and expand its capital, making it a beacon of power that eclipsed any other civilization in human history. The development of advanced technologies, many of them derived from inhumane experiments conducted in concentration camps that were still operating, allowed the construction of infrastructures that defied the laws of physics. The process of building Germania was not quick or easy. Over the centuries, billions of lives were sacrificed to complete Hitler's megalomaniac vision. The human suffering that was hidden behind the marble and glass facade was unimaginable. Thus, in the dazzling avenues of Germania, under the artificial light of stolen suns from distant galaxies, the wind carried dry leaves and stardust alike, while the echo of footsteps echoed in the endless corridors of an empire that, in its eagerness to last 1,000 years, extended to the stars, carrying with it the shadow of hatred and oppression that had created it. A twisted history, a Third Reich that became eternal. The Second World War in a parallel universe was not the twilight of the Third Reich, but the dawn of a dark millennium dominated by the Nazi yoke. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, not only survived, but thrived as the ultimate global superpower. A future where the shadows of the swastika spread across the planet, shaping a dystopian world order that seemed unbreakable. In this alternate version of history, the strategic mistakes that led to the fall of the Nazis in our reality were avoided with cold precision. Hitler, always obsessed with expansion, decides not to venture into the vast and icy territory of the Soviet Union in 1941. Instead, the Führer concentrates his efforts on consolidating his ultimate control over Western Europe. France, subdued and broken, is just one more piece on the chessboard of a Hitler who now sees all of Europe as his playground. Italy, under the command of a docile Mussolini, is relegated to a secondary role, a simple puppet of the Reich. Meanwhile, Japan extends its empire into Asia, collaborating in the construction of a world where the voice of the Reich resonates even in the most remote corners. The Axis weapons become unstoppable thanks to technological advances that, in our reality, never saw the light of day. Jet planes take to the skies invisible to Allied defenses. Indestructible tanks cross borders with the ease of a leaf falling to the ground. Nazi war machines, perfected by engineers working day and night under the threat of a concentration camp, redefine modern warfare. Hitler moves shrewdly on the diplomatic chessboard. With the promise of power and wealth, he manages to attract neutral countries to the Nazi cause. Spain and Turkey, once wary, join the Axis, providing resources and strategic locations that transform Europe into an impregnable fortress. The Allies, weakened and demoralized, watch the world they knew crumble before their eyes. Nazi propaganda, more poisonous than ever, penetrates deeply into the minds of the subjugated peoples. Jews, Slavs, and all those considered inferior are erased from the European landscape with terrifying efficiency. Hitler's dream of a sustainable Reich is eventually materialized through mass indoctrination. Future generations grow up with the unshakable belief that the Führer is a god on earth, the savior of the Aryan people. With the Axis victory assured, Germany emerges as the undisputed superpower, dictating the terms of a new world order. Europe becomes an immense concentration camp, where Nazi ideology is brutally imposed. The governments of the occupied countries are mere puppets dancing to the rhythm of Berlin. The German economy, strengthened by the plundered resources of the conquered territories, reached unimaginable levels of production. Steel, coal, and slave labor combined to transform Germany into the workshop of the world. German culture is elevated to a pedestal, while the traditions and languages of conquered peoples are ruthlessly eradicated. Hitler sees himself as the emperor of a new world. The parades in Berlin are grandiose, a show of power where the masses cheer their leader with blind devotion. The Wehrmacht, backed by the most advanced technology, becomes the most feared occupying force in history. No one dares to challenge the power of the Reich, and those who try are crushed mercilessly. As time passes, Hitler ages, but his vision remains unchanged. He sees the future as an extension of his own will, a future where National Socialist Germany rules the world for centuries. In this reality, Hitler died of a heart attack in 1975 at the age of 86, making the question of succession a thorny one. The absolute power he has concentrated in his hands leaves no room for rivals, but death is inevitable even for the most ruthless tyrants. Among his lieutenants, the obscure Heinrich Himmler presents himself as a logical successor. His devotion to the Führer and his central role in the implementation of racial policies position him as the most likely candidate to continue Hitler's legacy. But Himmler is a man of shadows, more comfortable with terror and repression than with visible leadership. On the other hand, Hermann Göring, once a powerful man, has seen his star fade due to military failures. However, his ambition remains intact, and his desire for power makes him a dangerous player in the game of succession. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, could be another contender, although his lack of military experience weakens him compared to the generals who have forged the fate of the Reich on the battlefields. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's enigmatic deputy, might have been a serious contender if not for his betrayal. His flight to Scotland in 1941 to negotiate peace with Britain has left him in disgrace, and while his loyalty to the cause is unquestioned, his credibility has been irrevocably damaged. In the shadows, Wehrmacht generals watch and wait. Men like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian, whose strategies have ensured the victory of the Reich, could emerge as leaders in the event of a power struggle. They are men of war, forged in the heat of battle, and their loyalty is to Germany, not to a man. But military leadership could mean a change of course, a move away from the cult of personality that has defined the Nazi regime. However, the struggle ended when a 70-year-old Heinrich Himmler assumed the German chancellorship on a provisional basis. Its sole purpose is to make clear the mechanism under which Hitler's next successors, who would also be for life, would be chosen. 3 years later, with the mechanism fully in place, he resigned from office to make way for a young Führer of only 31 years of age. From then on, the Third Reich would be ruled by dozens of Führers, of whom only the first 13 were known in their physical appearance by the public. They were only known by name. According to official statements, the image of the Führer was not to be made public for security reasons, although the resistance thinks that the Nazi regime became a corrupt and bloodthirsty oligarchy that makes decisions under the name of someone who probably does not even exist. Steel lies, the Nazi propaganda that shaped the world. In a reality where the Third Reich emerges victorious, the power of propaganda becomes a weapon more lethal than any rifle or tank. Joseph Goebbels, the shadowy architect of the German collective mind, perfects his dark art, molding at will the public perception of the regime and the very essence of what it means to be human under the shadow of the Reich. From his position as Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, Goebbels transforms every corner of German life into a theater where truth is nothing more than a carefully designed construct to serve the Führer. Imagine, then, a world where the victory of the Axis is not a frustrated possibility, but a stark reality. In this scenario, the Nazi triumph is not limited to the battlefield, but extends to the soul of every citizen, of every child born under the flag with the swastika. Nazi propaganda, already perfected during the war years, finds its apotheosis in victory. Hitler's cult of personality, painstakingly sculpted by Goebbels, reaches new heights. Hitler is not only the Führer of Germany, he is the redeemer of the world, the Messiah who has brought order to a world plunged into chaos. The streets of Berlin, Paris, and Rome are lined with banners and statues celebrating the greatness of the Führer. His speeches, broadcast on radio stations in every house, resonate with unshakable authority, repeating over and over again the same simplified but powerful phrases that have become embedded in the minds of the people: one empire, one leader. Goebbels has understood from the beginning that complexity is the enemy of effective propaganda. These words are repeated in the press, in the classrooms, in the cinemas, where propaganda films show the Führer as the savior of the world, while the defeated enemies are represented as dark, almost demonic forces which only he could contain. The victory of the Axis, according to the propaganda narrative, is not only a military triumph, but the culmination of a moral struggle, where good, embodied by the Aryan race, has prevailed over evil. The images of the enemy hordes, Jews, communists, and Democrats, are repeated ad nauseum, not as mere adversaries, but as subhuman plagues that threaten to destroy civilization. Now, with the Reich victorious, those threats have been exterminated or are in the process. What remains is the task of consolidating the new world order. In the latter, propaganda is a tool for legitimizing Nazi domination over conquered territories. In Paris, the Germans are celebrated as the liberators who have saved France from itself, from the decay of its republic. In London, those who survive under the Nazi boot are educated to see their conquerors as benefactors who have brought lasting peace and unparalleled prosperity. Victory parades are not just displays of military power, but rituals of psychological domination, designed to show the vanquished their place in the world's new racial hierarchy. The cult of Hitler, which in times of war was an instrument to unify and motivate the German people, is now expanding to encompass the entire globe. In schools in Tokyo, Cairo, Havana, and Sydney, children recite passages from Mein Kampf, learning from an early age that their loyalty is not only to their nation, but to the Reich that now rules the world. The image of Hitler, now almost deified, becomes a ubiquitous symbol of authority and order. Goebbels makes sure that every film, every book, every song that is produced glorifies the Führer and his conquests. Fear, which during the war was a tool to mobilize the people, is now used to maintain control. Nazi propaganda, always adept at manipulating emotions, paints any form of resistance as a betrayal not only of the Reich, but of humanity itself. Public executions of dissidents are broadcast as media spectacles, brutal reminders of the consequences of challenging the established order. Images of these purges are displayed alongside images of the prosperity that the Reich has brought, contrasting the darkness of the past with the light of the new Aryan world. In the conquered territories, Nazi propaganda is adapted to re-educate the masses. In the classrooms of Moscow and Warsaw, history is rewritten, transforming the leaders of the Axis into heroes who saved their peoples from communist anarchy. The old national identities are dismantled, replaced by a new identity imposed by the Reich. Children are the main target of this campaign. In youth organizations such as the Hitler Jugend, they are taught not only to worship the Führer, but to despise everything that is alien to Nazi ideology. The values of obedience, loyalty, and racial purity are inculcated through songs, games, and lessons designed to ensure that the future belongs to the Reich. Propaganda not only shapes the mind, but controls the soul. Goebbels, in his perverse vision, makes sure that there is no room for doubt. The radios, always on, repeat the same slogans day after day. The films that are shown in cinemas are not just entertainment, but visual sermons that preach the virtues of Nazism. The books, censored and purged of all dissent, present a history that never was, where the greatness of the Reich is an unquestionable truth. But behind the grandiose proclamations of victory and order lurks a darker reality. Goebbels' propaganda machine is so effective because it understands human nature in its most basic form. Understand that the constant repetition of a lie can transform it into truth. Understand that fear can be a powerful ally, and that despair can cause people to accept even the most egregious of realities if presented to them as the only alternative to chaos. In this alternative world, where the Third Reich rules supreme, propaganda is not just a tool of the state, it is the state itself. It defines every aspect of life, from what you learn in schools to what you think about in the solitude of the night. The citizens of the Reich, those who have survived the purifying fire of war, now live in an unsettling peace, a peace where every thought, every action, is policed and shaped by an ideology that leaves no room for individuality or dissent. The victory of the Axis has allowed Goebbels' nightmare to become the reality of the world, a world where truth is nothing more than a word without meaning, where history is only a tool of manipulation, and where humanity has been reduced to mere cogs in the relentless machinery of the Reich. And as the Reich expands, its shadow grows, covering the whole world in a darkness from which there is no escape. From New York to Beijing, the world at the service of the Führer. In this alternate reality, the territorial expansion of the Third Reich became a plague that spread from the shores of the Atlantic to the vast steppes of Asia. The Reich, intoxicated by its victory, threw itself into a maelstrom of conquests. Occupied France became a mere province, a pale shadow of what was once a proud nation. Paris, the city of light, was extinguished under the weight of the banners with the swastika, while its inhabitants were subjected to an existence of submission and terror. The capital's once vibrant streets now echoed with German boots, marking the pace of an occupation that seems to have no end. Further east, the vast Soviet Union disintegrated into fragments under the pressure of the Nazi advance. The Urals, that natural barrier that the Russians thought would protect their land, were only a temporary obstacle. With the relentless speed of the Blitzkrieg, the panzer divisions crossed the Russian plains, crushing all resistance under their tracks. Moscow fell with the muffled whisper of a broken people. Its leader, Joseph Stalin, reduced to a myth of resistance who died in the cold prisons of Siberia. But it was not all violence and fire. The Reich knew that military control was not enough. They needed more. In the conquered territories, a strategy of soft domination unfolded, a slow but sure intoxication of the minds of those under its yoke. Propaganda became the Third Reich's sharpest weapon, infiltrating every home, every thought. The Nazis were not seen as invaders, but as saviors, liberators from a communist yoke that had suffocated the nations under their weight. In Ukraine, for example, the Nazis found allies among nationalists who had been oppressed by the Soviet regime. Berlin shrewdly used these internal divisions, playing on the aspirations of these peoples to consolidate its power. In exchange for loyalty, they offered a future full of empty promises, where autonomy was limited to serving the Germanic master. However, this control was not absolute. Hatred is not easily extinguished, and in the shadows resistance grew, poisoning the confidence of the conquerors. The partisans in the forests of Poland and Belarus became the thorn that the Reich could not extirpate, attacking from the darkness, inflicting damage on the vast German war machine. But the Reich, with its characteristic brutality, responded with ferocity. Every village that gave refuge to a partisan turned to ashes. Every family that fed a resistance fighter paid in blood. But the resistance continued, fueled by hatred, the last resort of the oppressed. The relationship between the Nazi center of power and the occupied territories was a mixture of exploitation and repression. Factories in France, Poland, and the Netherlands produced weapons, not for their armies, but to feed the Reich's insatiable war machine. The fields, once fertile, became deserts of forced production, where men and women worked to exhaustion, their bodies broken by the weight of an empire that knew no limits. Germanization was imposed with an iron fist, in a frantic search to erase all traces of national identity in the occupied peoples. The German language was not only the language of the oppressor, but the only one allowed, while local traditions and customs were quickly suppressed. In the occupied cities, Nazi commissars ruled with absolute authority. Jews and other undesirables were hunted like animals, plucked from their homes, and sent to concentration camps where fate awaited them in the form of black smoke and ashes. Meanwhile, in the territories beyond the direct reach of the Reich, the situation was no less bleak. The United Kingdom, perhaps the last stronghold of resistance, became a besieged state, cut off from the continent by a tide of steel and fire. Churchill, aged, tired, and extremely worried, led a people who clung to hope as the only remaining weapon. His immediate successors at the head of the government also failed to end the Nazi siege. The nights in London were illuminated not by the light of freedom but by the flames of bombing, as the British fought a war they knew they could not win, but also did not dare to lose. The resistance was fierce but insufficient. Across the ocean in the United States, the great American dream was crumbling. The Reich, shrewd as ever, did not confine itself to its conquests in Europe. Through a mixture of diplomacy and subversion, the Nazis managed to fracture the American nation. The East Coast, with New York as its jewel, fell under German influence, while the West Coast, with its industrial vitality, was absorbed into the Japanese Empire. The heart of America, its vast interior, became a battlefield of guerrillas and resistance, a country divided by an ideological war that was tearing apart families, friends, and communities. In Latin America, the seeds of Nazism found fertile ground in discontent and resentment toward the Yankees. Authoritarian regimes, hungry for power and support, allied themselves with the Reich, turning their countries into satellites of the New World Order. Nazi propaganda, so effective in Europe, found a willing audience in the South, where the ideology of white supremacy and hatred of communists flourished like a poisonous plant. The Jews who had sought refuge in those territories found themselves in danger again, haunted by the same ghosts they thought they had left behind in Europe. In Africa, Nazi colonialism brought with it unprecedented brutality. The resources of the continent were plundered to feed the Reich's insatiable war economy, while local populations were subjected to a regime of forced labor and extermination. Ethnic tensions, stoked by the racial policies of Nazism, became a breeding ground for extreme violence. Tribe against tribe, people against people, all under the indifferent gaze of a regime that only saw in them numbers, resources to be exploited and discarded when they were no longer useful. Finally, in Oceania, the Reich did not stop. Australia and New Zealand, isolated but not immune, became the last bastions of resistance in the Pacific. The beaches of Sydney saw the arrival of German submarines, while the jungles of New Guinea became the scene of a covert war, where local forces, supported by the remnants of the Allied powers, tried to resist the advance of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But the resistance, though heroic, was doomed from the start. Each minor victory was followed by a crushing defeat. Each hero became a martyr in a war that devoured souls without remorse. This world, forged in iron and blood, was the culmination of Hitler's dream, a dream which, in its realization, had itself become humanity's greatest nightmare. From desert to space, economic and scientific ambition on Earth and beyond. The economic model that emerged after the victory of the Axis powers is nothing more than a reflection of their oppressive mentality. The Reich does not trade with the world, it plunders it. From the bowels of Africa, Asia, America, and Europe itself, minerals, oil, rubber, food flow incessantly. The veins of the planet empty to fill the coffers of the Reich, while humanity slowly bleeds under the weight of its chains. In this world, the coal mines in Poland are deep living tombs where slaves work until their bodies break, discarded as mere worn-out gears. Wheat fields in Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, have become plantations of death, where every ear of corn is watered with the sweat and blood of those deemed inferior. In Germany's industrial cities, manufactured goods are piled up in endless lines, ready to be shipped to the furthest corners of the empire, where they will be sold at exorbitant prices, cementing the vicious cycle of economic dependence. Latin America, in exchange for its natural wealth, receives German machines, technology that promises progress, but which only feeds the war machine of an insatiable empire. In Asia, the sun has not set, but its light is cold and distant, eclipsed by the presence of the Reich and its Japanese ally. Southeast Asia is a scorched land, its jungles turned into vast rubber plantations, its oil drained to feed the insatiable thirst for power of Berlin and Tokyo. In Africa, the situation is even bleaker. The Germans, with their vision of racial superiority, have turned the continent into a laboratory of extreme exploitation. Apartheid policies, which once seemed unthinkable, have intensified to the point of creating a society divided between masters and slaves. where colonizers live in luxury and natives die in diamond and gold mines or endless cotton fields. But the rule of the Reich does not stop on Earth. In their eagerness to expand and over the decades, the Nazis have looked to the sky and have seen a new battlefield: space. The obsession with superiority has driven unprecedented technological development. Rockets that once rained destruction on London now carry men and machines beyond the Earth's atmosphere. The moon, cold and desolate, has become the new stronghold of the Reich, its surface marked by the shadows of military bases and research stations. Mars, the red planet, is next on the list. The Nazis, in their eagerness to create an eternal empire, see in the colonization of other worlds the last frontier of their expansion and as a sign of their undoubted superiority over the rest of human beings. On Earth, meanwhile, science and technology have become tools at the service of domination. Advances in biology and genetics do not seek to improve humanity, but to perfect the chosen few who are considered worthy of existence. Experiments on humans, justified by the ideology of racial purity, are commonplace in the laboratories of the Reich. The experimentation rooms are full of broken bodies, sacrificed in the name of science. Genetic manipulation becomes a dark art, where Nazi scientists play God, creating and destroying lives with the cold precision of a scalpel. In the military, medicine has been distorted to serve a single purpose: to prolong the ability to kill. The soldiers of the Reich are not humans but war machines, doped with drugs that suppress fear and increase aggressiveness. Surgical techniques have advanced to such an extent that wounded bodies are repaired on the battlefield with a rapidity that defies imagination, all to ensure that the Reich never loses a single soldier more than necessary. Medical ethics have been banished, replaced by a clinical efficiency that treats life as just another resource, something that can be spent, manipulated, or discarded according to the needs of the empire. Space exploration, however, is not only an extension of the Reich's ambition, but also an escape from a planet that has become too small to contain its greed. Rockets, powered by the most advanced technology, fly through space on missions that defy logic and reason. The colonies on the Moon, Mars, and planets that begin to be exploited from the 22nd and 23rd centuries are not just experiments, but the first steps of a much larger plan. The Reich dreams of a galactic empire, where the stars themselves kneel before the will of the Aryan race. Nazi propaganda, always present, now speaks of a manifest destiny that does not stop at the ends of the earth, but extends to the entire universe. Hitler's and Hirohito's successors are constantly talking about space travel. On the other hand, technology has become a weapon of absolute control. Surveillance systems are ubiquitous. Every citizen of the Reich is monitored, his movements recorded, his words heard. Cities are full of screens that endlessly repeat the message of the Führer of the day, reminding everyone that their loyalty is the only acceptable currency in this new world order. The machines of repression do not rest, always ready to crush any hint of resistance. The weapons, which are becoming more and more advanced, are not mere tools of war, but symbols of the absolute power of the Reich. Nuclear bombs, hidden in silos under the ground, are the last card in a game of total domination, a silent threat that keeps any nation that dares to challenge German supremacy at bay. Artificial intelligence, a creation that should have represented the pinnacle of human progress, has been corrupted by the Nazi vision. Autonomous systems are not servants of humanity, but slaves of the Reich, programmed to maximize the efficiency of exploitation and control. Machines rule the occupied territories with a coldness that can only arise from the total absence of compassion. Algorithms, created to optimize production, do not see people, only numbers and resources that can be used and discarded as appropriate. Monuments of supremacy: how Hitler redesigned history through architecture. In the year 1933, when Adolf Hitler assumed power in Germany, no one could have foreseen that his architectural vision would so profoundly mark the identity of the Third Reich. For Hitler, architecture was not simply a matter of building structures. It was the physical representation of National Socialist ideology. Their buildings were to be monumental, eternal symbols of power and grandeur, capable of inspiring the masses and subjecting them to the domination of the Aryan race. Under the guidance of Albert Speer, Nazi Germany began to design a series of constructions that went beyond what any 20th century mind could have imagined. As mentioned before, Berlin was destined to transform into Welthauptstadt Germania, an imperial city that would eclipse all others. Meanwhile, in the city of Nuremberg, Hitler had decided that the grounds of Zeppelin Field would be the scene of the majestic parades and meetings of the National Socialist Party. Here, every September, the famous mass rallies took place, where thousands of soldiers marched in unison, lined up with pinpoint precision, while flags with swastikas waved over the heads of the crowds. The architecture of this place was not accidental. Each column, each platform was carefully designed to amplify the sense of power and unity that Hitler wished to instill in his people. It was a theater of propaganda, a space where architecture mixed with politics to form a powerful tool of social control. With the defeat of the Allies in 1945 and the consequent victory of the Axis, Nazi architecture expanded beyond Germany's borders. In Paris, London and Rome, buildings began to emerge that reflected the influence of the Reich. In the ancient City of Light, the Nazis planned the construction of an Arc de Triomphe even larger than the one that already adorned the Champs-Élysées, a symbol of their victory and of France's submission to the New World Order. London was not exempt. The Nazis erected there an imposing government building on the banks of the Thames, designed to impose respect and fear on the British, reminding them daily of the supremacy of the Aryan race. Meanwhile, on the African continent, lavish colonial administrative centers were built. Each of these buildings was a beacon of Nazi rule, where brutalist architecture blended with classical lines to reflect the mix of force and order that the Nazis sought to impose on their conquered territories. Cities such as Johannesburg and Nairobi became showcases of this colonial power, with avenues flanked by statues of Nazi leaders and monumental buildings reminding locals of their place in the Reich hierarchy. But the architectural expansion of the Third Reich did not stop on Earth. In their megalomaniac vision of global domination, the Nazis also turned their gaze to the cosmos. With the development of space technology, projects to colonize the Moon and Mars began to emerge. Lunar cities in particular were designed to be both functional and symbolic. Each dome, each station, bore the Reich's seal on its structure, with swastikas carved into the linings and imperial eagles guarding the entrances to the facilities. These colonies were not just human settlements. They were extensions of Nazi power in space, designed to perpetuate their dominance beyond earthly limits. However, not everything in Nazi architecture was destined for grandeur and splendor. The concentration camps, cold and calculatedly designed, represented the darker and more dehumanizing side of this architectural vision. Auschwitz and Dachau, initial examples, were just the beginning of a system that, in this alternate history, expanded and evolved in unimaginable ways. With the Nazi victory, the camps became a global tool of oppression. These places were much more than extermination centers. They were structures designed to break the human spirit. The efficiency in their construction and operation was such that, over time, the fields began to operate with automated systems, monitored by advanced technology that minimized the need for human intervention. Cameras, drones, and sensors replaced the guards, making the death machine work even more ruthlessly and accurately. In the conquered territories, similar camps sprang up to control the subjugated populations. In Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and even in the space colonies, the Nazi machinery of oppression was present, a reflection of the ideology that the Reich sustained. Even on Mars, humanity was enslaved under the architecture of terror. Shadows in the Empire, the hidden war against Nazi tyranny. The days of the Reich turned into centuries, and the ashes of the past gave way to a reality that devoured the entire world. The resistance, despite being doomed from the start, persisted, fueled by the despair and hatred accumulated towards a regime that had no end in sight. In the heart of Germany, the few who dared to challenge the Führer found themselves embroiled in an unequal struggle. In the early years, the resistance was a murmur muffled by the cries of Nazi propaganda. However, as the decades passed and the promises of a glorious Reich crumbled into the reality of an endless dictatorship, those murmurs turned to screams. Political parties that once represented the hope of the proletariat, such as the socialists and communists, faded underground, their leaders killed or exiled. But ideas are hard to eradicate. In the shadows, new resistance cells emerged, small groups meeting in dark basements, exchanging pamphlets printed on makeshift presses, dreaming of a free Germany that existed only in their hearts. Universities, once centers of free thought, became an intellectual battleground. The students, inspired by the memory of the White Rose, who once defied the regime, began to organize. They had no illusions of overthrowing the regime, but desperation drove them to act. Every pamphlet distributed, every poem written, was an act of defiance that, though small, was a spark in the oppressive darkness. Not all of them survived. Most were captured, tortured, and eliminated before their voices could echo beyond the walls of their cells. But their names remained etched in the memory of those who stood still, as a reminder that resistance, however futile, was an act of humanity. Even within the ranks of the army, loyalty to the Führer was not absolute. The disgruntled military, those who saw the true face of the regime and could not bear it, conspired in secret. The failed attempt of July 20th, 1944 was only the beginning. Over time, new plans emerged, new betrayals. However, the Nazi machine was relentless. Each coup attempt was put down with a brutality that only the regime could deploy. The conspirators were executed publicly, their bodies displayed as a warning to anyone else thinking of defying the Führer. But the seed of discontent was already planted, and despite the repression, it did not stop growing, slowly poisoning the roots of a regime that was believed to be indestructible. Outside Germany, the world was in a state of perpetual resistance. In America, Republican, Democratic, Liberal, Socialist, and Communist movements found common cause in the struggle against Nazi imperialism. The streets of Buenos Aires, Havana, and Santiago were filled with demonstrators who, although they knew they could not defeat the Nazi giant, refused to accept its rule without a fight. In the United States, resistance was organized in more subtle ways. Spy networks spread like a spider's web across the Atlantic, feeding European resistance movements with vital information. The agents, operating in absolute secrecy, knew that a single mistake could cost them their lives. But the hope of a world without Nazis was enough for them to keep going. Europe, occupied and destroyed, did not surrender without a fight. The French resistance, which had begun as a scattered group of patriots, became an organized force that carried out acts of sabotage, espionage, and anti-Nazi propaganda. The derailed trains, the burned factories, and the murdered Nazi officers were a constant reminder that, although the Reich had triumphed, it was not invulnerable. The mountains of Poland and the plains of the Netherlands became refuges for guerrillas, who, armed with what they could find, attacked the occupying troops in swift and deadly ambushes. There was no honor in this war, only a desperate struggle for survival. And the exiles, those who had escaped the Nazi yoke, did not remain inactive. From London and Moscow they planned, conspired, and sent resources to their compatriots in the occupied land, keeping the flame of resistance alive. Asia and Africa, lands exploited and plundered by the Nazi regime, were not silent. In the jungles of Asia, anti-colonial movements united in a common cause against oppression. The fighters, who had previously fought against the European imperialists, now faced an even more ruthless enemy. Guerrilla warfare spread across the continent, with ambushes, surprise attacks, and sabotage keeping Nazi forces on constant alert. In Africa, liberation movements multiplied. In the deserts of the north and the jungles of the Congo, fighters faced Nazi troops with a ferocity that only the struggle for freedom can inspire. And while most of the time the resistance was crushed, every victory, no matter how small, was a reminder that the struggle was continuing. The methods of resistance were as diverse as those who carried them out. Sabotage became a common tactic. The factories that produced weapons for the Reich were prime targets. Supply lines, vital to keeping the war machine running, were constantly attacked. Civil disobedience, while risky, also became a powerful tool. Strikes, protests, and boycotts of German products were organized in secret, challenging the regime on its own turf. And propaganda, that dark art of psychological warfare, became a double-edged sword. While the Nazi regime flooded the world with its propaganda, the resistance countered with clandestine pamphlets, secret radio broadcasts, and subversive literature that kept alive the hope of a free future. However, the Nazi regime was not blind to these threats. Repression was his response. With technological advances, mass surveillance became a reality. Drones flew over cities, spying on citizens. Artificial intelligence systems analyzed every conversation, every movement, looking for signs of dissent. Dissidents were identified and eliminated before they could act. The manipulation of information was taken to new extremes. Truth became a malleable concept, shaped by the needs of the regime. The techniques of torture and elimination were perfected, with concentration camps becoming death factories, where prisoners were not only killed but dehumanized in scientific and psychological experiments. Despite all this, the regime, in its arrogance, underestimated the power of internal destabilization. Constant sabotage, civil disobedience, and international alliances slowly eroded the Nazi power base. Internal divisions within the regime, fueled by discontent and betrayal, became a crack in the facade of invincibility that the Nazis had so painstakingly constructed. And although the road to liberation was long and full of suffering, the resistance continued. The collapse of the Axis. When the superpowers crumble and a new order emerges. The Axis began as an alliance forged in the fire of shared hatred and unbridled ambition. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, three states together for a common goal: global domination and the annihilation of their enemies. But, as often happens when absolute power becomes the only end, what began as a fraternity of convenience ended up becoming a ruthless rivalry. In the mid-20th century, Germany's Third Reich expanded across Europe and North Africa, crushing those who stood in its way. At the same time, Japan was engaged in its own imperialist enterprise, establishing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for its brutal conquest of Asia. Initially, both powers shared a mutual respect and a veiled distrust, aware that their ambitions could not coexist peacefully forever. During the first centuries after World War II, tension between Germany and Japan began to grow palpably. The Third Reich, now a power that stretched from the Russian steppes to the shores of the Atlantic, viewed the growth of the Japanese Empire in Asia and Oceania with suspicion. Japan, for its part, felt the pressure of the German advance eastward, which threatened to collide with its interests in the Pacific. America was also a source of discord. The United States, divided in two, had a delicate borderline that moved from one side to the other, according to the fragile agreements between the European and Asian empires. Meanwhile, Italy, the weakest of the trio, found itself in an increasingly precarious position, a shadow of the power it had once been. As time went on, the balance of power shifted inexorably toward Germany. In the 23rd century, the absorption of Italy by the Reich was little more than a formality. Italian fascism, once so ferocious, had become a footnote in history, subsumed under the German boot. This move marked a point of no return for Japan, which saw Germany's continued expansion as a direct threat to its own empire. The Axis, once an alliance, had become a ticking time bomb. The rivalry was not limited to borders and territories. It extended to the economic and technological sphere. Germany and Japan invested incalculable resources in research and development, always seeking to outdo each other. Germany, with its focus on territorial expansion and the consolidation of its military power, and Japan, which saw advanced technology as the key to maintaining its independence and dominance in Asia. In the field of robotics and artificial intelligence, the two powers competed fiercely, but it was in the space race that this rivalry reached its climax. The early years of the 26th century saw the start of an arms race in space, with Germany and Japan vying to establish permanent military bases on the Moon, and later to be the first to plant nuclear bombs on Mars. Rocket launches and manned missions became propaganda spectacles, each designed to demonstrate one nation's technological superiority over the other. The conflict that everyone feared broke out in the 30th century. The war between Germany and Japan was as devastating as it was inevitable. The battlefronts were not limited to Earth, but spread throughout the solar system, with fighting on the Moon, Mars, and space stations orbiting the outer planets. It was a war that lasted decades, a war that no one could really win, but that no one was willing to lose. Armies, exhausted by years of relentless conflict, began to crumble. Millions of lives were lost, and the economies of both nations teetered on the brink of collapse. What had once been a struggle for interstellar dominance morphed into a war of attrition, where resources, morale, and sheer will to fight slowly eroded to nothing. At the heart of this storm, The Third Reich and the Japanese Empire faced a threat they had not anticipated: internal resistance. Over the centuries, discontent had grown within the populations oppressed by both regimes. Inspired by the never-abandoned ideals of freedom and self-determination, resistance movements began to coordinate attacks on power structures, sabotaging both military forces and political machines. In Japan, where the rigidity of the Bushido Code had stifled any form of dissent, insurgencies arose that spread like wildfire. In Germany, the seeds of resentment planted over generations of oppression and endless war blossomed into a revolt that took leaders by surprise. The resistance, though initially fragmented, was crucial in further weakening the two warring titans. The internal battles became the final burden that neither nation could bear, and it was then, in the midst of the confusion and chaos, that a new superpower emerged on the world stage. It came not from the ashes of fallen empires, but from nations that had been subjugated and trampled on for centuries. United by common suffering and hope for a different future, these nations seized the opportunity to free themselves from their former oppressors. Germany and Japan, unable to maintain their empires and exhausted by war, eventually succumbed. Regimes that had ruled with an iron fist, that had built their civilizations on the foundations of war, hatred, and exploitation, collapsed. For its part, the new emerging superpower took drastic and innovative measures to rebuild both the economy and society on an interplanetary scale. These countries, united by the need to survive and thrive in a post-war solar system, adopted radical approaches to reversing the chaos left by the former empires of Germany and Japan. The three most important approaches were respect for ethnic and cultural diversity, the establishment of free and independent countries in the former occupied territories, and placing the economy and technology at the service of the people. A grim but motivating ending, the legacy of the millennial Third Reich. Until now, this alternative history has been approached from the point of view of efficiency and brutality, the domination of three powers over the rest of humanity, resistance to oppression, and the inevitable future friction between the Axis powers. However, the supremacy of the Third Reich did not come without cost. Germany's relentless expansion demanded an administration that was soon overwhelmed by corruption and inefficiency. As the regime spread, the bureaucratic apparatus inflated, becoming a paper monster that devoured resources and time. Corruption, endemic and rampant, undermined the morale of the people and eroded loyalty to the Führer. The once loyal senior officials became more interested in preserving their own interests and privileges than in maintaining the cohesion of the regime. Constant warfare also played a pivotal role in the collapse of the Third Reich. Nazi Germany, which had depended on a perpetually expanding war machine, faced economic stagnation quite often, with brief periods of prosperity and waste. The endless exploitation of conquered territories could not be sustained. Resources were depleted, and war production, instead of serving as an engine of progress, became an economic yoke. The cities, subjected to a state of constant surveillance and militarization, suffered from a severe lack of basic infrastructure. The economic deterioration was palpable, with an increasingly disgruntled population, tired of constant propaganda and daily brutality. The rivalry with Japan further exacerbated the problems. Technological competition between the two Axis powers reached absurd levels, with each nation trying to outdo the other in the space race and in the development of advanced weapons. Germany, despite its impressive war machine, could not match Japanese technological innovation in several areas. The loss of prestige and the inability to maintain supremacy in these fields created tensions that resulted in constant conflicts over territories of influence. Resources plummeted as forces were worn out in an endless tug-of-war. In Germany, underground movements infiltrated the structures of power, carrying out sabotage and attacks that destabilized the oppressive system. In Japan, insurgencies flourished, driven by a deep hatred of German hegemony and a desperation for freedom. Meanwhile, the environmental impact of the Nazi regime's unbridled exploitation began to be felt. Ecological devastation and environmental degradation severely affected the quality of life. The brutal policies of the Third Reich, which prioritized war and oppression over sustainability and well-being, led to environmental crises that made daily existence even more unbearable. Lack of resources, pollution, and natural disasters became pressing problems, exacerbating the social and economic crisis. As internal and external pressure accumulated, the fall of the Third Reich became imminent. The regime, worn down by endless war, rampant corruption, and the rise of resistance movements, began to crumble. Ongoing clashes on the battlefronts and internal discontent resulted in a series of infrastructure collapses and social chaos. The power structures, once so imposing, collapsed, and the collapse of the Third Reich became a reality. The legacy of this millennial regime was an amalgam of desolation and warning. Culture under the Third Reich was truncated, condemned to a state of brutal homogenization. Cultural oppression suppressed creativity and free thought, but it also gave rise to a rich culture of resistance in the shadows. Artworks, literature, and music emerged as testaments to the struggle and hope of the oppressed, reflecting the struggle for freedom in a world dominated by totalitarianism. Technological innovations, while impressive in their scope, were often used for oppression rather than humanitarian progress. The technological race between Germany and Japan left a legacy of advances that, while useful, were often used to bolster authoritarian control and surveillance rather than improve people's lives. The darkest legacy, however, was the systematic violations of human rights over centuries. The memory of millions of lives lost and the suffering inflicted by the Nazi regime served as a grim reminder of the atrocities that absolute power can engender. The world, emerging from the shadows of the Third Reich, had to face a profound reflection on morality, justice, and the need to protect human rights against excessive power, perhaps in terms that humanity could never have posed before. In the final collapse of the Third Reich and its allies, a new world order emerged, one based on ideals of freedom and respect for others. This new order sought to eradicate totalitarianism and foster cooperation between countries and planets, trying to learn from the horrors of the past to build a fairer future. Although the scars of the past never fully disappeared, the world was faced with the monumental task of rebuilding and moving forward, armed with a brutal lesson about the limits of power and the importance of freedom.